Now we're on to the muscles that move the forearm. So in this case, we're talking about muscles that move the radius and the ulna. Okay? Before, when we talked about muscles that move the arm, we were talking about muscles that move the humerus. Now we're looking at muscles that move the radius and the ulna. So biceps brachii flexes and supinates the forearm. So biceps, the short head originates on the coracoid process of the scapula, long head on the tubercle above the glenoid cavity, inserts on the radial tuberosity. You don't have to know that, but sometimes it actually helps to know things like this. So biceps brachii going from your scapula all the way down to your radial tuberosity. So when you think about that, when it contracts, it's going to pull your forearm towards your upper arm, but because it attaches on the radius side, it's also going to twist your arm. So therefore, it's going to supinate at the same time. It does both simultaneously. Brachialis is the muscle that runs directly underneath biceps brachii. So look in the lower right-hand picture. See how they've cut away biceps brachii? Underneath it, you can see brachialis. It's like a cradle that biceps brachii fits into. So brachialis, interesting, it runs from the humerus to the ulna. Notice how clever your body is. You've got biceps brachii that runs from the scapula to the radius, and then brachialis that runs from the humerus to the ulna. So what happens when both contract together? You get a nice, smooth, even flexion of your forearm, because you've got muscles pulling on both of the bones of your lower arm. Is that clever or what? The answer is yes. So triceps brachii, triceps means 3 heads. Biceps has 2 heads, and actually if you make, if you flex your forearm and make a big biceps muscle, if you push down in the middle of your biceps, there's a crease in there. Biceps brachii actually has 2 parts to it. Well, triceps has 3 parts to it. So look in the upper left. See on the right side of that person, look on the back side of their upper arm. See how there are 3 completely separate sections? Each one of those is part of triceps brachii. That's why it's called triceps. It has 3 heads. It extends the forearm. It does the opposite of what biceps brachii does. Lateral medial heads on the humerus, long head on infraglenoid tubercle. You don't have to know that. Inserts on the ulna. But opposite sides of the arm, opposite motions. Notice biceps brachii, anterior side, it flexes. Triceps brachii, posterior side, it extends. So now let's continue, I guess, with a couple more forearm muscles. Supinator supinates, all right? So it's a deep muscle. You can't see it from the surface. It's down deep underneath. And so we just saw that biceps brachii helps to supinate. Supinator, that's really its only job. So it runs from the lateral epicondyle of the humerus down onto the radius. So what it does is it literally pulls on the radius, and it pulls it laterally. So it pulls it towards the outside of your arm, towards the lateral side, and therefore it causes your arm to supinate so that you can hold a cup of soup. Then pronator teres, it does the opposite motion. And the neat thing about it is if we could be in class and actually look at the models, we would see that supinator and pronator teres form an X, which makes sense because they do the exact opposite of one another. In other words, they form like perpendicular lines. One of them pulls in one direction, and the other one pulls perpendicularly opposite to that. So it pronates the forearm. So it runs from the medial epicondyle of the humerus down onto the radius. So they actually form an X, and we would be able to see that if we were in the classroom. But just remember, all you have to know are the actions. So supinator supinates, and pronator pronates. How easy is that? Then brachioradialis. Brachioradialis is a muscle that extends from the brachial region down onto the radius, all right? So it originates on the humerus. It starts way up in your upper arm, and it comes down all the way onto your radius. So it flexes the forearm. It also helps to pronate and supinate back to neutral position. So it will pronate if you're in anatomical position. If you're already, it'll supinate back to your neutral position. All right, so it doesn't by itself supinate. Doesn't cause you to additionally supinate. It will supinate just to where you're back to the normal position. So Those are all muscles that move the forearm. Inserts on the radius again, brachioradialis, from the humerus to the radius, brachioradialis. Okay, now flexors of the wrist and the fingers. So many years of doing this have taught me that these are the most difficult muscles of the human body for students to learn. If we were in the classroom, each one of you would have an arm model of the muscles on your table. And I would be showing you these things, and I would be going from table to table, and we would be finding all of these muscles. They're really not hard. Most of them say exactly where they are and what they do. So I try to show people that whereas it looks really initially confusing and complicated, that in fact, if you pay attention to the name of the muscle, they tell you where they are and what they do, and it makes it easier. By the time we get done doing this in the classroom, everybody's like, oh, damn, that was easy, wasn't it? And I said, yeah, it really was, even though you thought it was horrible when we started. So, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, and palmaris longus all flex the hand and the digits, okay? So, just going to have to look on the diagram here because we don't have the models in front of us. So, flexor digitorum superficialis. So, here's something I want to point out to you right now. When it comes to the forearm, all the muscles on the anterior side, just think about it. Look at your own forearm right now. And imagine you have muscles on your forearm. Imagine what's going to happen when those muscles contract. They're going to pull your wrist towards you, aren't they? So basically, the muscles on the anterior side of your forearm are practically all flexors. What we're going to see then as well is that the muscles on the posterior side, so right now, pronate your forearm. Now look at all those muscles look at the back side of your forearm. Imagine the muscles in there. Imagine what's going to happen as those contract. They're going to hyperextend your wrist. Are you watching? This helps a lot if you're doing it on your own body. You can see it. In the classroom, that's what we would be doing. So the muscles on the anterior side of the forearm, most of them are flexors, whereas the muscles on the posterior side are extensors. And that right there gets you the answer like half the time. I mean, if you see a muscle on the anterior side, good chance it's going to have flexor in the name. If there's a muscle on the posterior side, good chance it's going to have extensor in the name, okay? They all originate, at least in part, on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. They all insert on the carpals or the phalanges. So, again, carpals are the wrist bones, phalanges are the fingers. So, again, note that the flexors are found on the anterior side of the forearm. All those muscles are going to they're going to basically cause you to make a fist, and at the same time pull your wrist inwards, okay? And then here, extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, all extend the hand and the digits. They're all found on the posterior side of the forearm, and that makes sense. If they're on the posterior side, they're pulling your fingers and your wrist upwards. They're extending and hyperextending. All originate on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus again, all insert on the metacarpals or the phalanges. Note that they're found on the posterior side of the forearm. Movements of the thumb are weird because in the embryonic stage, your arm is folded up in a weird way. So the actions get weird names compared to what you think they might be. So notice flexion and extension. Flexion basically means moving your thumb across your palm, and extension means moving it back to where it started. So that's flexion and extension. All right? Whereas abduction and adduction, turn your hand now sideways and move your thumb away from your first finger and towards your first finger in an up and down. So if you hold your palm flat, when you do abduction, your thumb goes towards the floor, and when you do adduction, your thumb goes towards the ceiling. I wish we could be in the classroom. It's so easy to see. It's hard to explain with words. So, names for movements of the thumb are unusual because although the fingernails are posterior, the thumb in anatomical position sits at right angles to the fingers, with the thumbnail facing laterally. You don't have to work your way through that, but if you want to, that'll explain why the names of the thumb movement are weird. Extension and flexion move the thumb away from or towards the fingers. Abduction and adduction move the thumb anteriorly or posteriorly. All right? Thumb also has a special movement called opposition, where the thumb goes over across the palmar surface of the fingers. Latin word for thumb, by the way, is pollex. So whenever you see a muscle that works with the thumb, it's going to have the word pollex in it, or the adjective form, which is pollicis. So anytime you see pollicis or pollex, that means the thumb. And here you have the cows. Well, there it goes again. And here we sit without opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs are what makes your hands so useful. That's what allows you to pick things up and manipulate things. If you had hooves like a cow, or like I mentioned before, if your fingers are like a dog or a cat, they can't really do things. You know, cats can't answer the phone. I mean, they can knock the phone over. Of course, they don't have phones like that anymore. So, never mind. All right, muscles that move the thumb. Flexor pollicis longus flexes the thumb. Originates, you don't have to know. Abductor pollicis longus abducts the thumb and extends it. Originates, you don't have to know. Extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis extend the thumb and abduct the hand. So, if you look at that illustration, all right, if you look at the posterior superficial view, the one on the left, you can see the three muscles there together. And by the way, let's see. Flexor pollicis longus you can cross off. We don't have to know that. We just need to know abductor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis longus, and extensor pollicis brevis. So if you look on the left side of that illustration, notice that from lateral to medial, or in other words, from your finger towards your thumb, it goes extensor, extensor, abductor, longus, brevis, longus. One more time. Extensor, extensor, abductor, longus, brevis, longus. So extensor, extensor, abductor, longus, brevis, longus. So extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, abductor pollicis longus. Right? And that's the order they go. So much easier if we had arm models in front of us. I wish we did. But instead we're stuck with just having to try to look at the diagram. The anatomical snuff box, that's different than what might be the first images that come into your head. Anatomical snuff box, if you take your own hand and arm and kind of like lift your thumb up, just using common simple terms, you can see two big tendons at the base of your thumb, and they form a little pocket in there. That little pocket is called your anatomical snuff box. That's because back in the old days, they would take finely ground tobacco mixed with scents and flavors, and you sprinkle it in there, and then you snorted it. All right, you inhaled it. That's the way people got their nicotine fixes back then. So what I was describing, you can see in the lower right of that diagram, those two tendons. So notice one of those is the tendon of extensor pollicis longus. Then you can also see the two tendons of extensor pollicis brevis and abductor pollicis longus. They form that little notch, that little cradle, that little indentation. That's where people sprinkled their tobacco, and then they went and got the tobacco in that way. They didn't have cigarettes and pipes so much back then. They just carried around this powdered tobacco. This is all came from the New World. This is Columbus. Tobacco didn't exist in Europe and in Asia. Tobacco is a New World. It's a product from the Americas. So it took Europe and Asia by storm. It was like, yeah, tobacco. Sir Walter Raleigh wrote a great poem called Tobacco, Tobacco, Tobacco. People loved it because it makes you high. It makes you all hopped up. Damn. So, yeah, perfect receptacle for snuffing, as they called it. Snorting, the word more likely now. Okay, that's your anatomical snuff box. We're going to continue with more muscles in the next one.